Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson, and I've got the results from a survey that many of you took based on 60s television. Now, the last video I did was a video on my favorite TV shows from the 60s, and I went through all kinds of shows, went through about maybe 100 shows, and many of those I really grew to love as a kid. Now, I grew up in the decade following the 60s, so I saw most of that in reruns, but nonetheless, I still loved them. So I had a lot of these questions come up. I talk about these things with friends of mine, and I thought you might like to weigh in on some of these. The first question I posed on the survey was Ginger or Mary Ann? Now, this is an age-old question, and I think it was back in the 90s that I first remember hearing about this question about who would you choose, Ginger or Mary Ann? And I chose Ginger. I'm a Ginger guy, although what's not to like about Mary Ann? But I remember in the 90s hearing about this kind of challenge, or which one would you choose, and Mary Ann was always the winner. Let me just give you the results from my personal Pop Goes the 60s survey. We had Mary Ann at 73%, Ginger at 27%. So that's quite a wide margin. I didn't think it'd be that wide. And very early on, I always found Ginger to be somewhat of an intimidating woman. You know, this Hollywood, this glamour, very untouchable. I think that's one of the reasons Mary Ann gets chosen over her, because Mary Ann is the girl next door. She's kind of the girl you might marry, as opposed to Ginger, she's the girl you might take to the senior prom. And so that's how I always looked at those two. Both beautiful women, and interesting because Ginger, Tina Louise, had been around a little bit. She had done some films, she had done some recording, she was singing, and she had done a lot of stage work. And Dawn Wells, who played Mary Ann, was a little bit more new to the scene. So when they got together on the set of Gilligan's Island, Dawn Wells learned a lot from Tina Louise, particularly makeup, camera views, lighting, all those things that shows your beauty at its best. And very few were better at that than Tina Louise. So those are the things she taught Dawn Wells. Now, Dawn Wells taught Tina Louise a few things, and Tina Louise had a mother who was a wonderful cook, but she needed help cooking, so she asked Dawn Wells to help her with a Thanksgiving dinner.
Oh, that's cute. That's really cute. Tina didn't cook, and when she married Les Crane, she said my mother was a phenomenal cook, and she said, would you teach me how to do a Thanksgiving dinner? So she came to us a couple weeks before Thanksgiving. We shopped, my mother and I shopped, we chopped, we did everything. She sat in a stool and took notes, but we did the whole Thanksgiving dinner for her, and I often wondered, did she ever use it? And when Caprice, her daughter, was about 12, we had done a ABC morning show or something, and Caprice said to me, you know, Mama tells that story every year about how you taught her Thanksgiving. And when I did my cookbook with my mom, I called Tina for a recipe, and she gave me my Thanksgiving recipe, which I thought was cute.
Okay, going to our next one. I've got another Oktoberfest here. This is Lakefront Brewery. 'Tis the season. Thought I'd get one in here on this beautiful evening, a little bit overcast. Okay, next question. Very much in line with the Ginger or Mary Ann. We're going with Genie or Samantha. Why stop at Ginger or Mary Ann? We got two beautiful blondes here, Genie and Samantha, as opposed to a brunette and a redhead. So this was a lot closer. We have Genie, played by Barbara Eden, at 55%. Samantha Stevens, played by Elizabeth Montgomery, at 45%. So much tighter there. I was always a bigger fan of Bewitched. For some reason, I think that just seemed more plausible. Samantha seemed more like a housewife trying to make the paranormal work for her and her family, whereas Genie was just a little more out there. She wasn't quite trying to make it as work in Major Nelson's world, I guess. But fun stuff, crazy stuff. And both were on about the same amount of time. Bewitched started in 64, went to 72. I Dream of Jeannie went 65 to 70. Competing networks, Genie on NBC and Bewitched on ABC. And Bewitched was a very big hit show. The first 3 seasons, it was in the top 10. And in season 5 and 6, it was number 11. So that was a very popular show, and more so than I Dream of Jeannie. Next, we have another pair of shows that were competing from competing networks, and that's the Munsters and the Addams Family. And I was always a Munsters guy. I couldn't stand the Addams Family. I'm not quite sure why. They just went further than I was able to suspend my belief, apparently. And both were on 1964 to 1966. So each were only 2 seasons at the same time. Munsters was CBS and Addams Family was ABC. And the Munsters tied with Gilligan's Island for number 18, and I think 64 that was, the first season. So that was the more popular of the two. And in our survey here, this was a lot closer. Munsters won out 53% to 47% over the Addams Family. Moving along to the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits. This was a absolute shellacking. Twilight Zone, 85% to 15% of the Outer Limits. Now, I always found the Outer Limits to be much more scary, and I think for that reason I probably disliked it a little bit more, or liked Twilight Zone a little bit better. And I like the fact that the Twilight Zone was mainly a half-hour show, except for the 4th season where it branched out to be an hour. Again, you have competing networks here coming up with their sci-fi show, Twilight Zone on CBS and Outer Limits on ABC. Okay, we're going to go to some westerns here, and I pose the question, Hoss or Festus? Not exactly as glamorous as Ginger or Marianne, but just as, in many cases, just as popular. I was always a fan of Bonanza over Gunsmoke, and the character I remember the most was Dan Blocker. So he played Hoss, and for some reason he was just the central character for me. I don't know, because he was such a big guy, he had the bigger hat, he had the leather vest on. I don't know what it was, but he always stuck out to me. And he died at the age of 43 following gallbladder surgery. And the show pretty much, the season after that, the ratings tanked and they just gave up on it. And Michael Landon said years later, anytime he had to do a scene where he had to cry, he thought of the death of Dan Blocker. All right, moving along here. Oh, which Catwoman? All right, so I got a little flack on this one. So I posed the question, which Catwoman, Lee Merriweather or Julie Newmar? And a couple of people said, where's Eartha Kitt? Well, I never really felt she was ever in the running. She was already 40 years old when she did that. I didn't think she really looked the part. And when you got to follow Julie Newmar, it's not like Cheryl Ladd following Farrah Fawcett. I didn't think it worked, so that's why I just kept it to Lee Merriweather and Julie Newmar, because I'm a big fan of both. And Julie Newmar won out. She was at 76% to 24% Lee Merriweather, so a sizable margin. Lee Merriweather was the youngest of the three, and both she and Julie Newmar were in their 30s when they did the Catwoman character. And I didn't realize this, but Julie Newmar was in a show prior to this called My Living Doll, where she plays like a robot or something. I've never seen that one, but that's what I got to put on my list. That sounds very 60s, doesn't it? Animation, Flintstones, or the Jetsons. Now, I didn't realize how much longer the Flintstones was on in primetime than the Jetsons. Jetsons only being on 1 season, and 6 seasons for the Flintstones. And the Flintstones were quite a big hit. Top 20, well, here's the rankings of the 6 seasons. 18, 21, 30, 33, 60, and 70. So the last 2 seasons had tailed off there, but what a big hit. We're talking top 20 here? Well, it was the 60s, wasn't it, folks? But I always liked the Flintstones better. I mean, I'm kind of a guy that looks more to the past than to the future, hence this channel. But the Flintstones were based on the Honeymooners, I guess, too. So they were based on something already very successful. Next one, we have Barney Fife or Sergeant Schultz. So I was just focusing on 2 male supporting leads, I guess you'd say, or supporting actors in 2 very popular shows. Now, Andy Griffith, a lot of you commented saying that was one of your favorite shows of the decade. So that was clearly probably the most mentioned favorite among those that made comments on it. And it was on for 8 seasons before it turned into Mayberry RFD. So it went from 60 to 1968, and surprisingly, it only hit number 1 in the last season. I would have thought it would have been the other way around, but it was in the top 10 every single year, ranging from the lowest it was number 7, the highest it was number 1. So Don Knotts quit after 5 seasons, and the reason that was, he probably never would have quit, but when Andy Griffith signed him originally, he told Knotts we're going to go 5 seasons. So Knotts had been preparing after season 5. He was already lining up a lot of film roles. So he had commitments, so he had to stick to those commitments. It was probably time anyway, and he did some guest stars after that, but it seemed to work out for everybody involved. Oh, I almost forgot. Barney Fife, the Barney Fife character, he's at 65% to 35% over Sergeant Schultz. I probably should have had Colonel Klink be up against Barney Fife, because he's maybe the more popular supporting actor of Hogan's Heroes, but I just went with John Banner. And Hogan's Heroes was also a pretty popular show, hitting in the top 10 in its first season, which was 1965-66, and that went till 1971. Okay, we're back to some sci-fi here. Star Trek or Doctor Who? Now, I probably should have said Star Trek or Lost in Space, but I'm not a sci-fi connoisseur. I started watching Star Trek I watched it as a kid. My friends all watched it. I was never a fan of it. Watched it more as an adult, and I find the campiness quite charming, actually, nowadays. But this was just a complete landslide victory for Star Trek, 87% to 13% for Doctor Who. Okay, we're down to Beverly Hillbillies versus Green Acres. Now, one of the comments I had in this comment section in the last video when I went through these shows is that Green Acres did indeed have some surrealism in the show, which I guess I never watched that show until I was a late teenager, until my adult years, and I never noticed it, but had some very funny stuff, some very good characters in that show. But you just can't beat Beverly Hillbillies. If I were to pick the funniest show from that decade that still makes me laugh the hardest, it's probably Beverly Hillbillies. I mean, you've got Mr. Drysdale, you got Jethro, you got all these characters that they all are scene stealers. There you go. And one of my favorite all-time guest characters is Mr. Epps, the beatnik guy. So Beverly Hillbillies was a huge hit. It was #1 show in its first 2 seasons. And here's how it went from 63 to 71. 1, 1, 12, 7, 7, 12, 10, and 18 in its last season. So that was pretty darn good. All right, and those are the results for my 10-question survey for Pop Goes the 60s. Hope you enjoyed that. I really thank you for taking the survey. These are just fun little things to create some conversation around and talk a little bit about some of the characters that we grew up with, and giving them some attention that some of them could really use, and just kind of fleshing out some of the reasons why we like them or don't like them. So anyway, I appreciate you watching. As always, I have a Patreon subscription that if you feel like donating to this channel in a bigger way, that's an option. I also have a merchandise area on my website, popgoes60s.com, and I'll occasionally add new things. So check out the new things that I've added since you've last visited there. I really appreciate it. And we'll be back here on Pop Goes the 60s with more great pop culture from that great decade.